right. Good morning, everyone, or maybe afternoon, based on where you're located today. Thank you so much for joining us for the 5th episode of our Pay Transparency Legislation series on preparing for the new year. Before we begin, I'm just going to run through a few housekeeping items. So please note that you will receive both the recording and the slides from today's event in 1 to 2 business days. So just keep an eye out for an email from PayScale. Today's event is also accredited by both SHRM and HRCI, and we will send those accreditation codes out in the follow-up email as well. Please note that all attendees will be muted during today's presentation. However, if you have any questions, please ask them in the Ask a Question module, and we will get to as many as possible at the end. We also encourage you to participate in a couple of the polls that will populate during the event today. Without further ado, I will turn things over to our presenters to introduce themselves and kick off the event.
Thank you, Amber. Well, welcome everybody. My name's Ruth Thomas. I'm Chief Product Evangelist here at PayScale, and I lead our thought leadership and spend my time focusing on the market challenges and the reward challenges that you all face as you go about your day-to-day jobs, and use that information to inform our product and solution strategy. I'm also very passionate about the whole topic of pay equity. It was a founding principle of the company Curo that I founded, and was actually acquired by PayScale back in 2021. I've got 2 great presenters with me today. Those of you who've been following the series will know Lulu very well, but Lulu, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever y'all are. I am Lulu Cycli. I am a senior corporate attorney here at PayScale. I work alongside very closely with my good friend Ruth Thomas here at PayScale to track all things pay equity, pay transparency, pay sort of laws. So that way y'all can have the most up-to-date information as possible. And we're very excited to have Ahmad here with us, who's a comp analyst at McGuire-Woods, who's going to be talking about his pay transparency journey over there. So Ahmad, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Thanks for having me, guys. My name is Ahmad Mahmood. I am the compensation analyst at McGuire-Woods. We are a US-based law firm with about 20 offices across the US and 1 in London. I manage mainly our staff compensation side, which happens to also include pay transparency. So glad to be here.
Great, thanks, Ahmad, and welcome. Actually, for those of you who were on, I think it was probably our last webinar, episode 4, we actually reached out to the audience and said if there was anybody that wanted to take part in research or join us on a webinar, then please put your hand up. And Ahmad was one of those kind volunteers, and that offer is always open. So anybody who's listening today, if you'd like to come and tell your story about your journey to pay transparency and the challenges that you're facing, then we would love to have you join us on one of these episodes. But for today's session, we're going to have sort of 3 parts to it. We're going to have an update from Lulu on pay transparency legislation since we all last met, and a brief look into 23. I'm going to give you an overview of what response we've seen from the market in terms of the legislation so far and how you can start thinking about preparing for that. And then the stage is open for Ahmad to tell us about his journey of pay transparency at McGuire-Woods. So Lulu, over to you. Do you want to give us a quick overview of what's happened since we last spoke?
Yes, absolutely. So if y'all have joined us on any one of our prior 4 pay transparency legislation series, this is not new information, but it's definitely good to kind of relearn it again. But 2022, we kind of deemed as the year of pay transparency, and you can see why. As y'all know, Colorado was the first state to start requiring employers to post their salary ranges and job postings back in January of 2021. They were the first in the thought leader world, and then you can kind of see this wave of states and cities that followed. Since our last meeting, we have had some updates that I wanted to provide y'all with. First and foremost, if y'all are a Washington employer or you're a general remote employer with Washington employees, you're very familiar with what happened 25 days ago. So on January 1st, 2023, Washington required employers with 15 or more employees, and they recently clarified that it's 15 or more employees anywhere in the country with at least one working in Washington, And if the job can be performed in Washington, you're required to post not only a salary range for a position and job posting, but you also have to post a general description of benefits. For those Colorado employers, this is very familiar sounding because Colorado also requires this in their law. So a general description of benefits truly just means this job is eligible for unlimited paid time off, 401k matching, healthcare, vision, dental, bonus, yearly bonus structure. That's it. That's all you have to post, a general description of benefits. Washington did put some teeth to their legislation, requiring that if employers do not comply with this law, for those lawyers out there, there can be civil actions for violations and damages alongside that. California was also the other big state to pass pay transparency legislation just a few weeks ago, or enacted just a few weeks ago. So in California, again, employers with 15 or more employees, and they also recently just clarified that the 15 or more employees can be anywhere in the country with at least one employee in California, and the job can be performed in California. Then you're required to post a salary range, a pay scale for any position. One of the things they clarified, and we actually wrote a blog post about it. We can send that to y'all after this webinar. But the Department of Labor did make some clarifications, including where those employees have to be. But they also made a clarification about commission. So if you are posting roles that in whole or in part are covered by commission, then the commission ranges have to be posted in the job postings as well. California did put teeth to their legislation. So the proposed penalties are between $100,000 and $10,000 per violation. But in California, they're going to give y'all a free pass. So if you get a warning, you get, I think, 30 days to fix it. If you don't fix it, then the penalties start adding up. The one big difference in California that the other states haven't proposed or haven't enacted is that California added record-keeping obligations. This is something that kind of went under the radar a little bit when the law first got passed. But employers now who are subject to this law, so you employ at least one person in California, you have to maintain records of job title and wage history for each employee that you employ for 3 years after the employee leaves. Not for 3 years, but once the employee leaves, boom, the clock starts ticking, then you have to keep it for 3 years. California also enacted pay reporting requirements similar to Illinois. We talked about that, I think, in episode 2 or 3 of our paid transparency series. We're not going to talk about that in great detail today. But if you're a California employer, check out the pay reporting webinar that Ruth and I did about pay reporting, where we dove into California and Illinois. And then finally, New York State. We talked about New York City in our last pay transparency legislation webinar, but Governor Hochul, right before the holidays, she signed the New York State legislation into law. So if you are an employer with 4 or more employees with at least one working in New York State, and any job you post can or will be performed at least partly in the state of New York, you have until September 17th, 2023 to post salary ranges in all your job postings. So you've got a little under 9 months to kind of get your ducks in a row. New York State, the law in New York State is almost identical to the New York City law. You have to post the good faith ranges. There's teeth if employers don't comply. But the difference here from the New York City law, there's 2 differences. One is that employers will be required to post job descriptions if a job description exists alongside their job posting. And they have to provide a general description of other types of compensation offered. So this is similar to the Washington law. This is similar to the Colorado law. So, this role is eligible for a yearly bonus based on company and employee performance. This role is eligible for health and dental and vision, etc. So that's the additional requirements and fringe benefits that you have to provide. If your role also provides stock options or other types of commissions, throw that in the job description as well. So we are, this year, we're going to be focusing not only on what's going to continue to happen in the United States in terms of pay transparency legislation, but we're going to start doing webinars about Canada and about the EU and UK. So if you are a global employer, watch out for those webinars coming later in the year. But I wanted to give you guys just a little taste of what's happening in Canada right now. The province of Prince Edward Island back in June of 2022 enacted pay transparency legislation, similar to what we've been seeing stateside. So there is no real definition of what an employer is. So we're not 100% sure what kind of employers have to comply. But if my fallback is if the job can be performed in Prince Edward Island, you should probably be posting a salary range in those jobs. But employers will be required to post the expected pay for a position. So whether that's just $1 amount, there's no negotiation, or a range like we've been seeing stateside, and all publicly advertised job postings. So that's what's happening in Prince Edward Island. And in Ontario, if you are an Ontario employer, you may be a little confused as to what's going on in Ontario right now. But the Ontario Pay Transparency Act of 2018 has been passed, but it will not become law until it's proclaimed. So the proclamation, so proclaim means enacted, on the US side. But that proclamation has been delayed pending the Government of Ontario's consideration of public responses to a paper that they've drafted in relation to this pay transparency law. That paper was enacted and issued for the public's response back in February of 2019. So we are still waiting to hear what's going on there. We're not 100% sure if it's going to continue, what the situation is. But Canada as a whole, if you are a Canadian employer, the federal government's Pay Equity Act did go into effect in January of 2021. And it does require all federally regulated private sector employees, including banks, radio, TV broadcasters, airlines, to ensure that their workers do receive equal pay for equal work of equal value. So that's meant, obviously, like in the US, our Equal Pay Act, to help women and other minority workers get fair compensation for their labor. So keep an eye. We're going to be tracking it. We're going to be looking into what's happening in Canada. There's a lot of pay reporting requirements already in Canada that we'll talk about in future webinars, but wanted to just give you guys a little taste of what's going on. I'm going to hand it back to Ruth. I think we're going to do a quick poll just to break it up.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lulu. We are going to run this poll for you now. I've got a couple of other housekeeping things that I'll address while the poll is running. But we're going to ask you to share whether you are in the position of sharing pay ranges in job postings. So is this something that you haven't got to yet? Is it something you're working on? We expect probably many of you are doing that. Are you sharing ranges only for locations where you're required to so far? Or are you in a position of where you're moved to do this for more or all locations? Or maybe you don't know exactly what's going on in your organisation. So if you want to let us know, vote away. We've been doing this same question for probably about the last 3 webinars. We're using it as a progress tracker. So each time we will share with you, I think in our year-end webinar, we shared how much progress we'd seen in the audience over the period of last year, and we'll do the same again this year. So if you think this is repetitive, or you think you've seen this before, or you're having a moment of deja vu, you are, but there's a reason to our madness. And then just from a housekeeping perspective, I can see already questions coming into the Q&A chat. Lulu, you can have a look at some of those. There's lots of good technical questions for you. We are going to leave as much time as possible at the end, hopefully about 15 to 20 minutes to answer those. So Lulu will start reading some of those and she can get back to you. But please keep putting questions in there. And I can see a lot of you are asking, will the session be recorded? Absolutely. And will the slide deck be shared? And yes, that will be, and that will all be in the content module, along with loads of other really useful links to collateral that we have related to this topic. So Amber, how are we doing? Are we getting people voting there? I can see we've probably got, there we go, right. Okay, so 20, I think you can all see the results too. I hope that 20% of you are not doing this currently. 23% of you are working on it, and 35% are sharing ranges for only where required. And that's where we see, the main practice happening at the moment. And then I'm going to mention it a bit later. We have seen obviously some employers who are ahead of the game or were potentially in a position to be ahead of the game in terms of the structures that they had in place. And so they have already moved to doing that to all locations. And there is an issue around that for remote workers, which Lulu can talk to when we answer some of those questions in the Q&A. So thanks for sharing your status there. Let's move on to our next section, what to expect in 23. So you've already, kind of given the game away. More is coming. What's coming, Lulu?
Well, if y'all were on any of our previous webinars, I was very adamant that 2022 was going to be the year of pay transparency and that things were going to slow down in 23. Boy, was I very heavily mistaken. We've actually, just in the first 3 weeks of 2023, we've already seen a handful of states propose pay transparency legislation. And to be quite honest, they were in states I did not expect. In Montana, they proposed pay transparency legislation very similar to New York State, to Washington, to California. The proposed legislation requires that if you are an employer with 15 or more employees and the job can be performed in Montana, then you'll be required to post a salary range in your job postings. It also proposes, similar to California, a record-keeping obligation requiring employers to maintain wage history for employees for 2 years after the employee leaves. Not entirely sure that Montana will see this through, but I'm definitely going to be keeping a close watch on it. Connecticut, I'm not surprised by Connecticut, but Connecticut did propose pay transparency legislation as well. It is a one-line proposal that pay ranges shall be posted in job postings. That's all it says. So we don't know who it's going to apply to. We don't know when it's coming, but we're keeping an eye on that. West Virginia also proposed similar pay transparency legislation, and for y'all who have been doing this for a while, y'all know that pay transparency legislation started way before Colorado did in 2021 by requiring, so some states enacted legislation requiring employers to provide compensation during the interview process or when a candidate asks for it. So West Virginia, while not proposing pay transparency in black and white in job postings, did propose a pay transparency law requiring compensation to be provided during the interview process. One more state came up this week, and I didn't have a chance to update the slide. But earlier this week, Hawaii also proposed pay transparency legislation. And I had to write it down on a sticky, so I apologize for that. But in Hawaii, if passed, which it looks like it probably will pass, employers, again, we don't know what that means yet. We'll get some clarification, I imagine, will be required to post salary ranges that reasonably reflect the actual expected compensation. So this is a little different from the good faith language we've been seeing in Washington and California and New York City. Hawaii did put out some carve-outs saying that this law will not apply to internal promotions or transfers, and it won't apply to public employers because public employers in Hawaii are all subject to collective bargaining agreements. If this law is passed, which it likely will be, the enactment date will be January 1, 2024. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. And for y'all who follow us, whether y'all get our emails or our blog posts, we are putting forth a new blog post called the Legislative Lowdown. So the first of the month, we're going to be putting out a blog post of what pay transparency or pay equity laws have been proposed the month prior. So keep an eye out in early February for what we know has happened in January, including these 3-4 states, I guess, that we just talked about on this webinar here. So I'm going to hand it back over to Ruth.
Great. Thanks, Lulu. Well, we obviously did see quite a lot of activity around pay transparency and that emerging legislation in 22. And we're now starting to see sort of some of the responses to that in the market. What we do know is that there are different estimates of this. I've seen some estimates of 1 in 4 workers, which we got from some BLS data, or 1 in 5 workers are going to be covered by some form of pay transparency legislation in 23. So the numbers of workers impacted is increasing. So as employers, we need to think about how to respond if we haven't done so far. And we do need to think, obviously, about the impact on remote employees as well. We are also seeing, this best practice, and this is something that we very much thought would emerge. We saw this happening with salary history bans, is that we will see more and more employers, getting their ducks in a row and putting themselves in the position to be able to post job ranges in all job postings, irrespective of location in the US, and for those multi-jurisdictional employers, outside of the US, potentially, taking that practice internationally as well. So, I think Microsoft were the first company back in June last year to actually do this, and we've seen a number of leading employers come out and announce that they're doing this too. It was a question that we asked in our compensation best practice report that will be coming out in February. So we asked quite a few questions around pay transparency practice. And we know, I'm not going to disclose a number at this stage, but, we know that there are, a number of employers who are actually undertaking that practice. What we've also seen, and it's, we're kind of reading this daily, is the number of employers being called out for malpractice or potentially seeking out loopholes in terms of complying with this legislation. So be without doubt, this is a brand and reputational issue. And if you do it wrong, you are more than likely to be called out. Very similar to when the UK legislation, the gender pay gap reporting happened, and there was a lot of public naming and shaming in the press. The more that this becomes practice, please be aware that this is, an important brand issue for you. And if you're trying to get buy-in, therefore, from your leaders about why you should be doing this, then, that's as good a reason as any. Interestingly, we've also started to see some technology trackers coming in place. There's one called comprehensive.io, which is based out of California, not surprising with the California legislation there. And they are tracking compliance of tech companies in California. So I think they're showing a current compliance rate of 55.7% of tech companies were actually disclosing a salary range in their job posts. So, this is all very visible now in terms of whether you're complying or not. Another point that I just wanted to make was, leading job sites like Indeed, like LinkedIn, like Glassdoor have also committed to including pay ranges on all the jobs that they post. And it's worth noting that if you don't provide them with one, they will use an algorithm to calculate the range. So just have a quick think about that. If it's not your pay range they're posting and they're using their algorithm, it may not be the right pay range for your organization. And if an employee sees that, then that may lead to some difficult or confusing questions from your employees. And I think above all else, we know the impact of the cost of living crisis and the concerns that employees have around wage inflation and around general inflation. All of our employees have a very heightened sensitivity and anxiety around pay at the moment. So their focus is very much on pay. And so they're going to be keeping an eye on this legislation. They're going to be watching what you do. So this is about engaging your key stakeholders, your employees here as well. So then in terms of getting yourself ready, our next webinar is going to go deeper here, and we've shared some of this information with you previously. But pay transparency is about much more than just posting pay ranges on job postings, and it's very much about establishing frameworks and a compensation philosophy that embeds fair pay. And really, to make that work, you need to get buy-in from your leadership team. This is as much a culture discussion as it is a compensation discussion. And it's a conversation about trust that ultimately leads to engagement of your employees. We know one of the key reasons why people are struggling to comply at the speed that the legislation is emerging is because of the groundwork that you need to do. So having that job architecture and pay structures in place that allow for appropriate comparisons between groups of employees so that you can put frameworks in place. If you're in a fortunate position of already having pay frameworks, before you start posting pay ranges, just make sure that you understand where your employees are falling in those. It's really important to understand the scope of your outliers, because that's where your problems will be if they start looking at the ranges in job postings. And, ultimately, although, this is a conversation about pay equity as well, because the reason this legislation is here is to ultimately close pay gaps. It's not a panacea for closing wage gaps. A lot of the ranges that will be posted, still there will be groups that are most affected will probably end up at the lower range of those spectrums. And there are some blind spots as well. Not all of the state legislation requires you to post information around all compensation. So bonuses and other types of performance-related pay and equity are often falling outside of the law. So really, making sure that you're doing some form of proactive pay equity analysis is still a must in your organization. And, really engaging your stakeholders. Who are the people who are probably going to hear the most about an employee that's seen a job posted with a range that is way above their compensation? It's going to be your managers. So training your managers and other stakeholders to have effective conversations is really important. Well, I hope I've not stolen all your thunder there, Imad, because we're going to hear about what you did on the journey to pay transparency. But do you want to give us a quick overview of McGuire-Woods and the work that you're doing there?
Yeah, so McGuire-Woods, we are a U.S.-based law firm. We provide legal public affairs solutions to corporate, individual, and nonprofit clients across the world. We are headquartered in Richmond, Virginia, and we have offices all across the U.S., Chicago, Illinois, New York City, San Francisco, Los Angeles, office in London, and among many others. So what my role is managing the full-on staff compensation cycle. So not only does that include salary transparency and all that fun stuff, but survey participation, market study, job creation, alignment structure, bonus and merit administration, and things of that nature.
Great. So you're very busy at the moment, I assume. So
yes.
So I recognized a couple of those state names there that I know this legislation has happened. So what's been your response to the recent legislation and what specific actions have you taken?
Yeah, I came into McGuire-Woods actually about a year ago, February of 2022. And one of the first things my director came to me said was, hey, New York City's passing this salary transparency legislation that was initially going in effect of May last year. Figure it out, let's talk. And at first I came from higher education background in Wisconsin, so we were only in Wisconsin. Salary transparency really isn't a thing there yet. So it was brand new to me, but it was good timing because it allowed me to learn what we were currently doing from a compensation standpoint, from a recruiting standpoint, and then kind of figuring out what are we doing today? What is this legislation saying we have to do? How do we get compliant? Who are the stakeholders? It allowed me to introduce myself to our recruiting team and say like, hey, I'm Imad, I'm the compensation guy. This is happening. How can we work together to make this work? Leadership. So really in New York City, it was really just evaluating, okay, do we meet this criteria? Yes. Okay, what do we have to do? We have to advertise our salary range. How are we going to do it? So with that delay to November, it coincided with us, getting our salary survey all finalized, refreshed, uploaded, and all that good stuff. And then being able to do an effective market study to say, okay, here to talk to our managers and say, okay, we've done an effective market study. Now beginning November 1st, we're going to need you to make sure you're advertising salary ranges in New York City, job postings. We feel this data is competitive and will put us at a good advantage still, but we have to make sure we're doing this. And then California was 2 months later, so it's kind of the same thing. And just having those conversations with, recruitment, leadership, the hiring managers who are impacted by those markets.
And how prepared were you? Did you have pay ranges in place already, or was that work that you needed to do before this compliance?
Yep, we had pay ranges already established. So again, it was just completing that market study and kind of looking at how it compared and making adjustments based on what the study showed us.
Great, okay. And I know our listeners like to hear the technicalities. So we get a lot of questions about, what did you actually include in the posting? So how did you approach what you were actually posting? Was it the actual pay range, or was it some other approach that you went with?
It's really case by case. And I say that because part of the conversations with hiring managers is kind of helping them understand what helps them at a competitive advantage, but making sure we're compliant. So again, it's looking at, what kind of talent are we looking for? Is this an entry level role? And does it make sense to post a full range or a subset of that range? Otherwise, on the other end, are we looking for a really qualified individual? Do we want to even advertise the lower end of the range? Do we want to, again, take a subset of the range, maybe the midpoint to the max, to kind of draw their eyes even more to the job?
Great. Okay. Thank you. Now, what did you do about enabling stakeholders? I talked about that, as good practice. There are obviously people who are part of this conversation and part of this experience. What did you do about enabling them, and who did you enable?
So definitely recruitment, because they're the ones doing this work, so want to make sure they have the necessary information and tools to be able to comply and feel comfortable doing so. Leadership needed to be involved, of course, because this is a cultural change for everybody. Whether you're like me and you're brand new to the firm, or you've been here 20 years, advertising salary ranges is new to our practice. And kind of explaining again what's happening. We got to do it. It's the law. How can we do it in a way, again, that makes us, still maintain a competitive advantage and kind of align with our business processes? And then the biggest one was our, managers who are impacted by this. So again, New York City, for managers hiring out of that office, giving them the necessary information. And California was kind of a step above because they had so many components to their legislation they passed, not only advertising our salary ranges, but, internal salary ranges upon request, the pay data requirements, and records retention. So a lot of that falls under my umbrella: records retention, completing a pay data report. But, on the other end, is making sure that they felt trained to have these conversations with external or internal individuals. So, kind of putting them in situational based questions, like pretend I'm an applicant and I ask you about why is the compensation range like this? So making sure they understood what is our compensation philosophy. Why is it that? How do we, administer our compensation? What is my job essentially? And, really wanting them to feel comfortable to have these conversations because, as a manager, the employee looks to them as a resource. Yeah. I'm always there, and I always want to remind them that you can always reach out to me. We can have these discussions together. But as the frontline manager, we want you to feel comfortable to have these conversations with whoever it might be.
Great, thank you. And how's it been going? I know it's still relatively early days, but have applicants responded more positively? Kind of what results or trends are you seeing?
So I talked with recruitment, and they said it's been quiet on that end of people bringing it up. But what we talked about was it's been good or it's been bad. And I say that it's been good that people have been applying to the jobs because they have an expectation of pay, or they didn't apply to a job because it didn't align with what they're looking for. So we're still kind of gauge on how you can measure that, but kind of keeping that in mind that there's different ways to look at what's been going on.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because I've also been seeing there's been a few surveys coming out that have shown that job postings with ranges are getting more applicants than those without. And particularly if you're looking at a certain demographic, so like Gen Z applicants, won't apply for a job if there's not a pay range posted, because their expectation is that is what should happen now. So were there any other challenges that came about as a result of this work and the project that you were doing here?
I think the whole remote work always makes it a little tricky. And again, thinking of, on the front end, how are we going to approach this job posting? Thinking of all those things ahead of time. Where do you want to post it? Is it going to be in New York City? What are you going to do if you have an applicant from New York City and the job can be done in New York? Trying to keep everybody on the same page and thinking long term, so we're not caught off guard. And just, we've only been impacted by a couple markets so far. The state of New York one, I think, will be pretty similar to what we've done in New York City, so I don't imagine too much. But I think what'll be good is if other states are passing their own legislation of pay transparency that doesn't impact us, is we can learn from it. We can hear from employers of, how they went about it or what worked well, what didn't work well, and how we can plan for, if this becomes a national thing and, we are required to do it in all of our markets, because sooner or later, it probably wouldn't be wise to be doing it in 15 of our 20 markets. We want to have some consistency and structure so we're all on the same page in our practices. And just learning from mistakes. This is new for all of us, especially myself personally. So everything I've done with, learning from, like these webinars of Pay Scale, World at Work, things like that, talking it through with my manager in-house with other folks of, how they think we can go about this, and just reflecting at some point and saying, okay, what went well? Hey, recruiting, what do you think? Do you think this is helping you? Do you think we can be more effective? Hiring managers, everybody's got an opinion, right? So kind of hearing from others about what can we do better? How can we plan to be better? Things like that.
Great, thank you. And any advice that you would give for anyone, just starting this journey, on how maybe not to make mistakes, or what would be your best piece of advice?
First things first is understand what the law is telling us to do. So we can at least have an idea of what we need to do and evaluate, are we doing it? Are we even close to doing what we need to do? Things like that. And join these types of webinars. You guys obviously are on episode 6, maybe 5 or 6 with more planned.
This is episode 5. Yeah.
And with more planned. And there's such good information shared here. There's good questions asked that allow, that you guys then expand on that may have not been thought of initially. And you just got to gauge it for how your organization is set up. If you don't have pay ranges, how can you, do this without a pay range? Well, you got to start somewhere else compared to if you already have a pay range set up. But one day at a time, as we always say, Well,
thank you for joining us and sharing your experiences. I know everybody will find that really useful. If you've got any questions for Imad, then put them in the Q&A. I can see it's a very active Q&A today, and I know, Lulu, I think you've been answering some questions, and the team, Amber and Morgan, in the background. But we've got a good 20 minutes now where we can go through some of those questions. So if you've got a burning question, put it in the Q&A, and we're going to try and get through as many of these as possible. So you can put that question to Lulu, Imad, or to myself. So Lulu, what's been going on? What's the most popular question? I think I've seen a lot about remote pay. You want to tackle that one first? Or
yes, let's tackle it.
Before you get going. I'll get in trouble from Amber. Right, we're running a poll in the background of the Q&A for the next 20 minutes. If you'd like to learn more about how PayScale Solutions can help you with the emerging pay transparency legislation, so we obviously have data and solutions and a software that can help you across that compensation management framework. If you'd like to find out more about how we can do that, then please just say yes or not at this time in that poll as we're going through the Q&A. We do have a new solutions page, which we put into the content module, where you can go and you can find more detail about our solutions and how they can help you with these challenges. But sorry, I cut you off there, Lulu. Remote work.
No, that was way more important.
That seems to be a hot question. What can you tell us about all those questions about remote work?
So there's kind of 2 buckets of questions about remote work. We got a question from Jackie. who said, we're a 100% remote company. If we post a position but don't intend to hire in a state that has pay transparency laws, are we still required to include pay ranges? Any special wording needs to be in the posting. So this is how a lot of companies in Colorado got in trouble when the law first came out. So back in 2021, if you were looking for a job, you may have seen postings that said, this is a remote position, but we're not accepting applicants from Colorado. The Colorado Department of Labor came out and said, nope, you guys can't do that. You guys can't exempt states that have pay transparency requirements because you don't want to post the salary ranges. You're running afoul of the law. This is not a good faith effort. Therefore, we're going to penalize you for doing that. So, Jackie, if I were you, I would not exempt any of these states if you're a general remote, especially if you're a general remote company. Employers, if you are posting a general remote job, it can be performed in any of the 50 states. And to be quite honest, you're going to be excluding the most populated state, California. You're going to be including the second most populated state here by the fall, New York State. And then, Washington and Colorado are quite populated as well. So you're going to be excluding a bunch of really great applicants, even if you do that. So we do not recommend doing that. Some of these states may, in Colorado, obviously, these states may view that as running afoul of the law. The other big question we're getting is, what happens if we're based in, let's say, like I live in Texas. Okay, so I live in Dallas. Let's say we're based in Texas, but we've got one person working in New York, we've got one person working in Washington, we've got one person working in California. Most of our people are in Texas. Let's say we've got a plant in Texas, and we're looking to hire more, let's say, like C-suite folks remote. Do we have to comply with the law? Yeah, absolutely you do. If you're hiring a general remote work job that can be performed in any of the 50 states, then you're required to comply with Colorado, Washington, California, New York City pay transparency laws. The only exception is that if you're posting for a job that has to be done in Dallas, for example, like you have to go into a plant, we're requiring you to come into an office, and you still have those folks in the other states, you don't have to post a salary range, right? Because the job can only be performed in Texas. The job can only be performed in a state where the pay transparency laws don't apply. So for any general remote work, this is the question you have to ask yourself. If the job can be performed in any of the 50 states, then I've got to post a salary range. If the job requires the candidate to have their butt in a seat in a state that doesn't require pay transparency, then you don't have to post a salary range. What we're seeing though, and I think Ruth can back me up on this, is, I know Ahmad was talking about their posting ranges, just based on location right now. And a lot of the people in the chat are saying the same thing, that and the poll showed, right? The poll showed that most companies, at least here in this webinar, are only posting ranges where they're required to. We're actually seeing a lot more companies coming to PayScale saying, this is too much work. Like trying to figure out, like, we have to post in Colorado, we've got to post in Washington, we've got to post in New York. We're just posting a range everywhere. And maybe what organizations are doing, which is what we do at PayScale, is we post a national range and then we post a high cost of living range. So the high cost of living range is for applicants who live in San Francisco, in New York, in LA. That's the high cost range. The national range is for everyone else, right? So that's how we're navigating it, because it's too administratively burdensome for us to figure out at PayScale, oh crap, which job are we going to post, Washington for, or whatever. So that's kind of how we're navigating it.
Yeah, and that was a couple of the questions I'd seen specifically on, handling geo. So you kind of explained how we're doing it here at PayScale. Right. Have you heard any other practice on that, or any other tips from anyone in terms of, what to do about geo ranges if it is for remote jobs?
Yeah, I mean, every day, I think HR at PayScale and my boss may be a little angry that I say this, but every day I go on LinkedIn and I look at jobs. And it's not because I'm looking to leave PayScale. It's because I'm truly just curious about what is my job particularly going for at another company. That's the first thing I'm looking at. And the second thing I'm looking at is how many of these companies are posting ranges. I looked at a job today that had it literally said, the job said, for New York City applicants, this is the range. For Colorado applicants, this is the range. For Washington applicants, this is the range. For, I think that was it. And California applicants, this is the range. It was a general remote job. I mean, you can do that. The ranges were not wildly or vastly different. They were slightly higher in New York City. Like the starting range was slightly higher in New York City. But that's kind of how I've been seeing other organizations do it. The other big question, I'm going to ask Ruth this question, is because she's the practitioner for PayScale here. So we were getting a lot of questions, and I was trying to type as fast as I could, kind of like the cartoon, you know, like when the cartoon animals type fast and like smoke comes out of the keyboard. That's what I felt like. But a lot of questions were, what the heck do we post? Do we post the entire range? Do we post the 20th to 75th? Do we post the 50th to 120th? Like, what is kind of your advice and guidance here? Because the laws don't make it clear.
Well, the classic consulting answer is, of course, it depends. Imad, I'm going to pull you in here because you talked about this in your approach as well. It depends on your approach to pay ranges. Like if you have a job-specific pay range, then it's more than likely that what you're going to be putting in the job posting is going to be something very aligned to that specific job and, you know, where you expect to hire people within that range. But if you have a broader pay range, potentially covering a number of jobs, or even you may have broadbanding, I know it's not as popular anymore, then you are going to want to focus probably for that particular role on the range where you would, as most of the law says, Lulu, in good faith, expect to pay, and a range of around kind of 20% either side of where would you expect to pay. I think that's what you said you had done as well, Imad, for your roles.
Yeah, so, you know, both California and New York say good faith effort in what you're going to advertise in the range. So keeping that in mind, then looking at, you know, how we have our comp philosophy set up, that's kind of what guides those conversations with the hiring manager and thinking of what are you looking for talent wise? Again, you know, like, again, if we're looking entry level, maybe we're not going to look at a whole range. Maybe it makes sense to advertise a full range because it's a hard to fill job and we're going to expect to find different people at different levels of their career. And again, if it's, you know, like that top talent we're looking for, you know, does it make sense to even advertise a full range or the higher end of a range? And then, you know, of course, what the other biggest key is the budget. What can we pay realistically internally? So we kind of look at a lot of different factors to think about what makes sense for each one. I think it's always going to be different, but it depends on your organization, your comp philosophy, your budget, you know, so many variables.
Yeah, I definitely underline that, your compensation philosophy, because, you know, if you have a good compensation philosophy and you're clear about what you're paying for in your organization, and that comes through in how you practice pay allocation and pay determination in your company, then deciding those ranges is going to be quite easy because you're kind of thinking about the job, you're thinking about the level of experience that you're looking for, you're thinking about the skills you want, I'm thinking about all my compensable factors, I'm thinking about the location where I'm potentially, you know, if there is a fixed location where you want that work to be done, and that will help you to determine, you know, what you think is the right range for that job. And so obviously, you know, if you don't have that, it's a harder task to do. But that's why it's so important to think about your compensation philosophy, think about why you're paying what you're paying for. Because once you get into the interviews or once you get into the acquisition process, you're in a much better place to be able to explain to people, well, this is why we would pay you this, or this is why we would pay you that. And, you know, after all, what the law was about is making sure that you're paying people the right amount for the right reasons and not the wrong amount because of their prior, you know, pay history. And remember, you know, fundamentally that's what this is about. Now, I want
to just piggyback off of what you just said, because a lot of questions we're also getting is, well, what happens if we post a range and then we end up offering higher than the range? You can do that. The law says you can do that. That doesn't prevent you from doing that, right? As long as the reason why well, of course, first, can you afford it, right? If you've budgeted and you've taken all the steps that Ruth and Vicky and we all tell you at PayScale to take, like the 4 steps before you post a job, And if you've budgeted that role, and let's say you post the entire pay range, let's say that's what you as a company have decided to do, and you get a candidate who maybe you're having a hard time recruiting for this role, you get a candidate that has much more experience than what you're advertising for. Let's say the candidate has a lot more education than the job required, and let's say the candidate lives in a really high cost of living area. You can, of course, go above the range that you've posted as long as you're doing it in good faith, right? And as long as you're doing it for objective reasons, right? It's not because you're going to be discriminating against the folks that are currently in those roles, like your incumbent folks in those roles. You have objective reasons why you offered 5% above the highest point of the pay range that you've posted. That's fine. That's okay. Just make sure that you have documentation as to why you did that. But I think that's fine. That's completely fine.
Yeah, that is. So let's see, we've got loads of questions coming in. There's one question here. It's about if the pay range is set. This is from Heather. If the pay range is set and not a range, can we post just one amount? Now, I know that was what we were doing originally, wasn't it, at PayScale? So do you want to talk us through that and why it needs to be a range, Lulu?
Yeah, so at PayScale, all of our roles we've posted ranges except for our commission-based roles. All of our commission-based roles have the same base salary, but the commission, varies based on experience, right? So as long as you can articulate, there is no movement from this role, from this number, like everyone gets paid this amount, that's okay. You may have to defend yourself later with an organization, with a state agency, but that's how we're doing it at PayScale. Is our commission-based roles, base salary is this. It does not change. It's the commission structure that changes, right, based on seniority. So just be a little bit careful there because the laws do say a range. But if you only pay this one salary for everybody, just make that abundantly clear in your job postings.
Now, I saw an earlier question, and I know you've been monitoring this, Lulu. You've talked about teeth a lot in the different state legislation. Are we seeing any penalties yet? Have you been able to track that at all?
Not yet, not for the New York City, California, Washington laws. There were some big names in Colorado that got dinged for running afoul of the law, for example, where they would post job postings that say, remote work can be performed in 49 out of the 50 states. Sorry, Coloradans, you can't apply. There were some really big lawsuits that came around there. And then lawsuits of just organizations not posting. This is what I tell customers when they come to us, the big risk taker customers, when they come to us and say, we're just not going to post and see what happens. And I say, great, but you're just going to end up spending money on lawyers. You're going to end up spending money defending yourself, and then they're going to force you to do it anyways, right? So just do the heavy lifting at the beginning when you're required to, and then smooth sailing for the rest of the time, right? I think that's a big. It's really hard, and I know it's really hard for ELT to really wrap their head around it. If you're a compensation expert, and you're on this call, you do comp for a living, or you're a lawyer that supports comp, you understand this, but sometimes it's really hard getting buy-in from executive leadership of why it's so important to do that. The other question I got, and it was too hard to draft it in the chat, is, so, and I use this example all the time, so my poor friend who works in tech, I never use his name, but he's a manager in tech, and he was asked to, they're recruiting software engineers. They don't care what level they are, right? So there's a general job posting for software engineer. They're looking for level 1s to seniors. In their job postings, they wanted to post the salary range between like 125 and 350. And I said, well, that's not a good faith range. And he came back to me and he said, well, it technically is because we're looking for level 1s through seniors. Like, so somebody could be paid within that range. And I said, right. But on the surface, it's not a good faith range. So I told him, I said, split it up. If you're hiring general software engineers, put a posting for a software engineer 1 and put that narrow range. Software engineer 2, put that range. Software engineer 3, et cetera, et cetera. So I know somebody had asked, like, what if we just post the entire range for this one role? You can. Is it going to be a good faith range? Probably not. So I would split it up into levels. So that way you get kind of the better good faith ranges.
Okay, let's just check out some other questions. There were some new ones coming in. I thought this one.
Actually, Ruth, let me ask you this question, because there were a lot of questions about communicating pay ranges to incumbents. Kind of what is your, I know how we do it at PayScale, but kind of what is your thought on that? Because it's not full transparency, right? It's not like I know what Ruth Thomas makes and Ruth knows what I make. But, you know, kind of what's your take on that?
Well, you know, we always talk here at PayScale about the concept of pay transparency being a continuum. And, you know, at the far end is you literally share nothing with the employee other than their pay slip. And then at the other end, you might be one of the kind of tech startup organizations who post everyone's salaries online. So it's definitely a spectrum, and you need to choose where you want to be on that spectrum. And part of that needs to be aligning with your own culture. As I've said many times, this conversation around pay transparency is very much a cultural and a values discussion. I think most people we see aiming to be at the point where they're either sharing pay ranges with employees. So each employee would know their own pay range. And for example, at PayScale, that was something that we did during our last year-end process. Everyone had in their reward statement was also told what their pay range. I'll ask you in a minute, Imad, if that's something you're doing at your organization, because I know you said you were communicating as part of the merit review. But it might also be that, you know, as you do the work and as you get to having some stable pay ranges and you get to grouping employees, that you're able to share those with employees, because the benefit of that is that at the moment, someone picked up on this in the questions I saw earlier. I talked about employees having a heightened sensitivity around pay at the moment. And that's because we're concerned about the cost of living. You know, some of us are concerned about how we're going to pay our mortgages, pay our utility bills. And so pay becomes a much more psychologically important thing to employees. And at the moment, employees are also seeing inflation go like this. And they're thinking, well, why does my pay, you know, not keeping pace with inflation? And if this keeps going on, you know, I'm not going to be able to afford, you know, to maintain my standard of living. And so, you know, it's really important that you communicate with individuals and you're kind of sorry, the point I was making was if you share pay ranges and for all grades, for example, in an organization, employees can see career progression and employees can see pay progression. And as a manager, it helps you to communicate, you know, what do you need to do? You know, when an employee comes to you to say, I want to progress my pay, and you go, well, sorry, I can't, you know, you're already near the top of your pay range. Then you can say, but if you did this, or you assume this responsibility, or if we thought about developing you for this role, then you could move up the career ladder, you could move up the pay ladder. And so that's why a lot of organizations are choosing to publish their pay ranges across the organization. Sorry, a long answer, Lulu, there. So.
No, that's okay. But I think that's going to take a while for a lot of organizations to get to. Like, that's like full, clear transparency. I did answer a question in the chat about that I don't know that we're there yet, right? I don't know that as a nation, we are quite there for full transparency, knowing what each other makes. If you are a public sector employee, that's something that you're used to already because you're bound by a CBA. Your salary ranges are likely posted. Like if you're like I used to work for a law firm in California, we did a lot of public employee. We represented a lot of like agencies, like public agencies. And if you go to like Transparent California, for example, and you work for the state or a city or a county, you can write in that person's name and find out how much they're making. I don't think it's in the private sector we're quite there yet. I know like for big law, like organizations like McGuire Woods on the attorney side, you know, there's something called the Kravitz scale. So like if you work in big law, you know, like if you graduated in 2023, you know what that starting salary is. So if a law firm says we pay on the Kravitz scale, like, you know, going in what year and what that salary looks like. It's interesting. And I know now, like last year, all of our webinars, we were talking about the Great Recession and how hard it was to get good talent. It was an employee market. Now we're kind of Great Recession, the Great Resignation. I'm so sorry. And now we're kind of moving into this recession mindset. So either employees are not moving, right? Or there's been a lot of layoffs, especially in the tech industry. So employees are looking to move. But, it is really important to get your executive leaders on board with you, your attorneys on board with you. Your attorneys can be your best advocates, because if they go to the executive leadership and they say this is going to be 7 figures to defend this lawsuit, but we could spend 6 figures now just getting our ducks in a row, executive leadership may just say, cool, we'll just do it now, right? I know we've run out of time, so Amber, I think you wanna close us out.
Yes, we are.
Talk for more time.
I know. Unfortunately, we are out of time for the day. But I did want to just mention one last time, everyone will get the recording and slides for all of this. I know we got lots of questions on that. So do not worry, 1 to 2 business days. Thank you all for being here, for your thoughtful questions. This is a really engaging event, and we appreciate it on our end. Hopefully you did on yours as well. Thank you to our presenters and to Ahmad for joining us today to discuss this important topic. Yes, little claps. And we will hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much again, and hopefully we'll see you at our next episode. Thanks.